Good afternoon, everybody. I feel very honored and happy for having the opportunity to share this table. Well, it's not a table since we are in a semantic conference. It's not a table. But anyway, 2 armchairs and 2 chairs with 2 of the leading figures in the field of formal semantics and syntax. I still do not quite understand why I was invited. But I have a guess. Last Sunday, asking Professor RIZZI and Professor KRATZER when exactly they were here at UFSC before, and looking at all those young faces at the audience now, I realized that maybe I am one of the few who sat here almost 20 years ago when they visit us for the first time. And here I am again. Or still. And having both of them with us at the same time, which by no means is that common, right, Professor KRATZER? You have been in before, but never had the opportunity. No. Okay. Made the organizer of the event think about a different format of debate. I would classify it as an informal, formal conversation. The armchairs should help to create the climate. What amazes me, parallel to this very special occasion to all of us, is the fact that 20 years ago we were a very small audience, and now we need an auditorium. That must be a good sign. I think that not only KRATZER and RIZZI are responsible for that, but also all the scholars that visited us here at UFSC throughout the golden years. When Carlos Mioto, Cristina Figueiredo e Silva, Roberta Pires de Oliveira, and Ruti Lopes lead research and teaching of formal linguistics and invited them. Just to name a few: Cardinaletti, Bianchi, Uriagereka, Raposo, Kierke, von Fintel, Dobrovic, Brenda Lacker, and so on and so on. Roberta, if you remember, the list goes on and on. Yeah, okay, yeah. And now, a new generation seems to be assuming the role. I quote a few, Sandra, Monica, Nubia, and so on, always counting on the experience and the expertise of Professor Pires de Oliveira. But before we go into the coordination of the discussion as to how they stand on the theme that highlights our event, syntax, semantics, interfaces, and the relation to cognition, let me briefly share with you how 2 of my dearest colleagues and friends, one syntactician and one semanticist, see the contribution of both to linguistics, to philosophy, etc., etc., etc. And later, should I have the chance, outline a question coming from Professor Carlos Mioto, who was with us here at the event for 2 days, but couldn't make it today. Maria Cristina Figueiredo, of Universidade Federal do Paraná, for example, shared with me her view on the importance of Professor RIZZI, and I quote, "His biography," and I think his bibliography, "is impressive, and there is no doubt that he is one person who is present in key moments in the history of modern linguistics. For example, it was him that called Chomsky for the famous PISA lectures in 1979, which resulted in Lectures of Government and Binding, Chomsky, 81. And also, Professor Figueiredo e Silva, and surely many among us, thinks that he is much more than that. RIZZI, so Cristina, is someone who thinks clearly and writes even more clearly. She associates these qualities to the formation provided by the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa. And she continues, saying that RIZZI goes to the very last consequences of his assertions, being of such a high intellectual honesty which you rarely encounter elsewhere. She goes even further, and I quote again, and that's important. If there was a Nobel Prize in linguistics, relativizing minimality would have won it. That's Christina talking, right? Since that book is spectacular and brings order into the mess that Chomsky's barriers made in the mid of the 80s with that talk about locality. In relation to the cartographic project, Professor Figueiredo e Silva confesses not being such a great fan of it. But here too, she thinks that Professor RIZZI will investigate until the very last prediction that the model makes. And that again is very notable. And she concludes her remarks saying, and that's really very personal from Christina's side, that RIZZI, I am not saying Professor RIZZI anymore, is a very nice guy with no signs of arrogance, with great humor, and she said a few things more that I better don't say. I think we couldn't agree more with Christina, right? I now share with you what my colleague Ronald Taveira da Cruz from Universidade Federal do Piauí so kindly told me about how he sees Angelika KRATZER. And I quote him too. Presenting Professor Angelika KRATZER to you is to describe the history of linguistics. Christina says the same thing, and Ronald says the same thing. So they are responsible for writing, making history of linguistics, especially when it comes to what we have learned about formal semantics and syntax. Besides showing us how language functions in our mind, she has inspired, and still does, works which would not even exist without her ideas, highlighting that she provided a new formula looking towards modals and conditionals in natural language, which inspired various scientists in formal semantics. Her analysis falls into the semantics of possible words, following Lewis 73. And Ronald quotes KRATZER herself. He thinks that this quotation says what KRATZER does in a sense. On a slightly simplified way, we might think of modal operators as of quantifiers over possible words. This set of possible words is then the domain that an if clause can restrict. KRATZER 91. Semantics of modals and conditionals is a fertile field of investigation, which led and still does, thankfully, analysis in many areas, not only in the framework of formal semantics, but also in the benchmark in other semantic branches, encompassing many questions related to the meaning of those constructions. But in KRATZER's investigation, he cites 78 and 91, according to Professor Taveira da Cruz, we can say that it occupies the top priority. Her proposal constitutes the theoretical framework for several papers and formal analysis of such construction in different languages. For example, von Fintel 94 in 2006 for English, Rui Marques 2014 for European Portuguese, as we could see yesterday, PIRES de Oliveira 2014, and PIRES de Oliveira and Scarduelli 2008 for Brazilian Portuguese, and the list goes on and on and on. Ronald goes on the listing major contributions of KRATZER, but I don't have the time to report it here because we are eager to interact with our guests. He only laments, I don't know the intonation of that he could not be here with us on this occasion to share the discussions. But he wants to express his congratulations to you for enriching linguistics, to fundament formal semantics, and for honoring us with your presence and ideas in this event. Okay, that's for my part. I translated the text, so I could not put Christina's flavor into it, but I tried. So what we thought about, we were thinking about the format of this debate was to make it as informal as possible. So we have no idea how it will turn out, no idea whatsoever. So if they stop talking, please help me and make them talk, okay? And I think we should start with each other making a question, RIZZI making a question to KRATZER, and KRATZER making a question to RIZZI. that doesn't mean that you have to be, now I have to make a question like on this level. So please ask everything what you want to know about those guys. Take the opportunity. And we make that, as I said, as informal as possible. So please, what goes into your heart, please express it. So I hand over, I don't know, ladies first, or, yeah?
So just any questions?
Any questions? Yeah, always wanted. That's a question that I want to ask.
Let's talk about the left periphery. Let's talk about these heads that you have. And so I'm sort of wondering about the semantic content of those heads, and in particular, no, I'm not, you don't have to answer. I'm just giving you sort of some thoughts that I may have about the content, and then you could just say whether it's a good thing or it's not a good thing. And so one idea I had is, I mean, just observing when, say, I talked about the left periphery, I was interested in very different heads from you. I mean, I'm sort of interested in mood, I'm interested in those heads. And so I'm sort of wondering about this topic head. And so I'm wondering about the focus head, particularly about the topic head. So one idea, I mean, as a semantist, in a way, topics are difficult. I mean, what is a topic? What is the semantic content? And one possibility I could think of is that the mere fact that you move an argument away from its standard position is maybe all that's needed for a topic. You just give it a special place and say, this argument is special. And so in that sense, the topic head, in a way, it would do no more than just being a landing site, and then it could even be filled by something more contentful, like mood or whatever the cartography comes up with. And so that was sort of one idea I had, how what we are doing, what each of us is doing, how it could come together, like in particular with topic, and maybe these heads have semantic content of a very different kind, and they're just, you call them topic because you need a place to give them, to make them special, and so there's no more than, say, an iconic interpretation that it has. And so that applies to topic, and focus is a little different, but maybe that could be another question. No, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if I should now try to answer or ask my question, and then everybody will forget about Angelika's question.
It's informal, so
it's
you
informal.
Decide. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think I'll address your question because, and that may give rise to another question, then maybe we go on with a debate. Okay, so what you just said about the lack of specification of topics is something that, in fact, I proposed at some point, and then I regretted having proposed it. So let's see. This is in fact in the early years 2000. I was interested in the locality effects that characterize the fact of using certain left peripheral positions. And there is one remarkable property of topics, which is that they do not seem to give rise to much of a locality effect. Particularly, I mean, what was particularly disturbing from the perspective that I was trying to develop, that was a 2004 paper with the rethinking of relativized minimality in terms of feature classes, right? So the idea basically was that it's not exactly the same feature that determines a minimality effect, but the feature class, in the sense that if you have an intervener and a target within the same feature class, you get a minimality effect. So, for instance, some kind of operator feature and some different kind of operator feature would give rise to a minimality effect. Now, the difficult case to deal with is topics, because topics, at least in languages that are very liberal in the use of topics, like the Romance languages, do not seem to give rise to any such effect. So a topic feature does not give rise to a minimality effect on another topic feature. For instance, take again my favorite language, which which is Italian. And then suppose that you have a main clause and an embedded clause. You topicalize something to the left periphery of the embedded clause. You can still topicalize something to the main clause, crossing the lower topic, no problem at all. In other languages there are problems, but not in the very liberal languages with clear cleft dislocation. So then the idea that I considered was exactly what you said. They used to say, well, maybe they don't have a real specificity. So in order to give rise to a locality effect, focus is different from this viewpoint because it gives rise to locality effects. You've got to have some content, and maybe the topic feature is, you know, very. Now, why did I didn't really regret that, and still it's one of the 2 or 3 options that I keep in the drawer to address this question. But the reason why I don't think this can be completely true is that there are certain conditions that topics must meet. So it's not the case that you just take any expression, you move it to the periphery, and you get something like, well, you get topic status. For instance, in some languages, there are constraints of the kind definiteness, specificity, for instance. And the other thing is that you cannot, I presume this could be derived also by pursuing the approach that you mentioned, but you cannot really license topics in out-of-the-blue context. So there is some kind of, the examples that I favor are examples in which, let's say, you have a transitive action. So, you know, what happened? Something happened, you consider, and you don't know anything about the kind of event that happened. And then you have a transitive verb, let's say, well, DP, verb DP, and then and with everything indefinite. In this kind of configuration, you cannot, for instance, have the object topicalized. You have to somehow refer in previous discourse to a set of objects which the direct object may be part of, something that reminds delinking or some notion of that sort. So there are certain this is one. There are certain restrictions on topics which may be not immediately accessible to an account by taking the null theory of topics, which is in essence the one that you proposed. So that would be my take on the issue. But I certainly agreed with you
that there's very little particular, I mean, what people call topics. I mean, there's certain anaphoric relationships, and so the question is whether it could be derived from something else. I mean, from the mere fact that you move.
So how did we do? So
Now you have a...
Is it my turn, or we just continue like that?
Turn, and if you have any questions, please hold them. So he is taking his question, and then afterwards we come back to what's been discussed. Okay? Okay, perfect. So, okay, there are many questions that came to my mind during your mini course that I followed with a lot of interest. Many relate essentially to what you said, to the cartography of these positions that you're interested in, and which are interestingly complementary to my positions. So maybe if we merge the two, we will get an even more structured left periphery. Then, and clearly, I think the input that can come from a semanticist is really crucial and critical for the kind of enterprise that I've tried to develop, particularly if you ask the question of the further explanation, you want to go a little bit further. That's why in Siena I try to interact a lot with Valentina Bianchi, who is a semanticist who has been influenced in important ways by your work. So I was kind of wondering, so there's no doubt about that. I was wondering about the reciprocal aspect. I mean, can syntax be of use to semantics? And I'm sure
the answer is positive. But I had in mind something more specific connected to your lectures. So you mentioned a number of very interesting cases in which if you move a causal complement to the periphery, then one of the interpretations goes away, essentially, right? And so I was wondering about the nature of this effect, which to me, but clearly it's a professional problem that I have, looks like a freezing phenomenon, right?
Okay.
So basically, when you have the structure with a certain interpretation, the clause is frozen, so you cannot move it, and if you move it, necessarily it's only the other interpretation with verbs like explain, and you had a number of verbs showing that. So I wanted to ask you exactly what do you think the crucial factor is which determines the fact that one of the interpretations goes away, and if there could even be a syntactic basis for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just sort of repeat what I sort of think is going on, and then you make the connection to freezing or something. And so what I was explained, maybe we have to tell everybody what the phenomenon is. And so you have a sentence, he explained that he had no money. And then you topicalize the that clause. You get something like that he had no money, we couldn't explain, or something like that. He explained he had no money. The most salient interpretation is as a speech report. He gave us an explanation. He provided an explanation for something. But if we have something like that he had no money is something that's hard to explain, then that speech report interpretation is no longer there. The way we interpret that sentence is the fact that he had no money is something hard to explain. Now there's something going on with the English example that I don't quite understand. I mean, but I would have to say, or what I say is that in principle, both of those explanations are, both of those interpretations are available when the that clause is in situ, and then one interpretation disappears, and probably, I mean, that could be brought out more clearly. And so I likened, I mean, for me, the parallel between that case, or I saw a parallel between that case and these very extreme cases where you have something like he sighed that he had no money, or he raged that he had never been given an explanation or something. So these are sort of cases where very, very, very clearly we have an unergative verb. We do not have a transitive verb, and so the speech report has to be created by something in the embedded clause. So it's in there. And the question, so then the idea was like what's going on with explain. I mean, so we have a very clear case where the speech report is created by the embedded clause, and we take that as a given for speech reports of this kind. And so that then led me to assume that in the explain case, it's a similar story. So we have the speech report, we already know it has to be created in the embedded clause, and so we assume that it's created in the embedded clause in this case as well. And so the next step was, okay, so that shows us that explain in a way has a transitive version and an intransitive version. And we discover, how do we discover the transitive version? Well, we look at DP arguments that those verbs have. And so when we look at what kind of DP arguments explain, a verb like explain takes, what we see is we explain a fact or something, and we just don't get a speech report interpretation out of a DP argument. And so that was one of the suggestions was, well, let's abolish semantic selection of clausal arguments. Clausal arguments are never selected. We just look at DP arguments. That tells us that that tells us what the argument structure of the verb is. That tells us what the verb contributes, and whatever other properties we may find with embedded clauses does not come from the verb, it comes from that clause. So that was in a way the reasoning, and I think the reasoning is coherent, so but I don't yet see how to get to the freezing effect. So so it's in a way, it's one interpretation is not available because the verb all by itself doesn't provide that to begin with. And so once you just move away that clause that could create a speech report from the verb, there's nothing left next to the verb. There's no direct object position left that this move clause could possibly relate to. So that was the story. I like the story. It's a very pretty story, I think. And but it doesn't, I think it doesn't, I don't quite see. So it's not, it's not that the verb in principle admits two interpretations and then one in a way disappears. It's,
Understand. Can I just add one line, just for the curiosity? I'll tell you what the analogy is that I saw with other things. So the analogy would be with the fact that if you manipulate a clausal structure in some ways, then the structure becomes unmovable in some situations. Now, understand that you don't want to manipulate the structure, and that may be the stumbling block of that. But the particular case I have in mind is this. So take in English, for instance, you can have a clausal complement with complementizer that or without. So I believe that John is sick, I believe John is sick, both, right? But then if you topicalize, the complementizer must be there. So you must say, that John is sick, I always believed, or that John is sick is widely believed. You couldn't say John is sick is widely believed, right? So there are various ways of addressing this this issue. There was an ECP analysis of that. Tim Stowell had certain ideas, but one possibility would be to think of an idea that Pesetsky had at some point, that complementizer deletion really is cliticization of the complementizer to the verb. Suppose that you do that, and then somehow the clause remains without a head, and suppose that the highest head is the locus of attraction to another position, then you cannot do it because you have already moved the head out, essentially. Okay? So that is one possible take. As it may just be my imagination, but I thought that at some point you talked about cliticization of something from the clause to the structure. So that was the idea that I somehow built through my imagination that probably took a completely different direction.
No, I think now I can see the connection, because you could see what I said as you have a silent say there, and that silent say may have to criticize to the upstairs verb, and then you can. Now I see the connection. We are on the same page. So that yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Do we have a question related to those two questions? Or later? No? Monica is there with the microphone, so no problem.
Actually, I mean, both explanations work. I mean, you can either, if you move, just continue.
Yeah, okay, please. It's informal.
If you move the embedded sentence with the say away, then there's nothing to hook up to. But then, I mean, if you sort of criticize the say to the upstairs verb, as you may have to do in some languages, then, I mean, you run into the other problem. Yeah. So either way, whatever you do, you go wrong, and both kinds of explanations may be needed in the end. Yeah.
You want to comment something? No? Okay, let's see what happens next. We got 2 questions from where? Monica, you have an idea? That's gonna be a total surprise. We don't know what comes, okay? So they have to turn and to see.
Right, so we have one question from a PhD student at the Universidade Federal do Paraná. He couldn't be with us today, so he emailed his question, right? Can everybody read it? Yeah? Okay. Do you want me to read it? Okay, so his name is Jean, okay, and he asks, so cartography of syntactic structures and formal semantics in generative grammar are enterprises born in the cradle of government and binding, being strongly articulated around the representational model and categories of analysis of that theory. The minimalist program is an enterprise which aims to wipe the syntactic model, often trying to get rid of concepts such as government and binding and representational levels such as the X-bar structure. How do you stand in relation to the minimalist program, and what would be its implications to current and future developments within your respective approaches?
So we leave it there, okay?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite long.
Yeah. We forgot some passages. Yeah. So it's for me, the question for me. No, I just wonder.
I can't answer it.
Please.
Yes?
No, it's not. I'm so wondering, it's not just for you. It's like
for both of you.
Of syntactic structure and
formal
formal semantics.
So it's both. It's both.
I love that part. So we have to. Okay.
I told you it's a surprise. So please,
it's a real surprise.
You start.
It's
more for you than.
Yeah, that was my impression. Well, so I guess the question is about the relation between cartography and minimalism. I think the relation is one of absolute compatibility. So I never saw, I mean, I heard occasionally cartography is an alternative framework to minimalism. That doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think cartography is a framework. It's not a framework at all. It's a topic. It's a research topic. So if you're interested in structures and in the fine details of structures, you've got to do cartography. And then there's the empirical question. Is it very complicated? Is it less complicated? Is it extremely simple? But there's no, in no sense, I think, can it be characterized as a framework. Of course, there are certain guidelines which are very useful, and there are certain ideas that are kind of coherent. For instance, the business concerning how structures like topic, focus, and so on, criterial positions, and so on. These are theoretical ideas, of course, but they are fully consistent with the basic tenets of minimalism, as far as I can tell. And in fact, if you think of any cartographic work that I know of, it essentially expresses properties of structures through the basic ingredients of minimalism, through merge, fundamentally, right? That's a fundamental ingredient, through probe-goal relations that somehow trigger movement. So all the fundamental ingredients of minimalism are there. There is one important empirical issue, which is how rich is the functional lexicon? Is it very rich? Is it very poor? Is it intermediate? And what are the possible co-occurrence restrictions between elements of the functional lexicon? These are empirical questions, right? And what cartographic studies try to show is that, one, the functional lexicon is very rich, and here there is a clear convergence with views developed in typological linguistics, for instance. If you think when typologists talk about possible targets of grammaticalization, they're essentially talking about the functional lexicon and the variety of elements in the functional lexicon. So the orders of magnitude that must be assumed if you put together, let's say, Cinque's work on the IP and my own work, and other work on the DP and so on and so forth, the order of magnitude is about the order of magnitude that has been identified in work in typological linguistics. So we are in essentially order of several dozens, maybe a few hundreds of elements that combine in the way in which in a way that is empirically justified, put together in cartographic structures. So I don't see any kind of opposition between the two viewpoints, and it seems to me that there is a clear complementarity in the sense that minimalism really focuses on the fundamental computational ingredients, on the elements of computations, and cartography focuses on the characteristics of structures that are generated by these mechanisms. And there's not only there's no compatibility, but as I tried to mention in my presentation, I think cartography can function as a generator of issues, of theoretical questions for theoretical work in minimalism or in whatever framework you may want to adopt, but certainly things are expressed in a way that are immediately relevant for the theorizing that is conducted in minimalism. So that, yeah, that is my position.
So my answer is very different because I'm not a syntactician, and so I like the first part here, formal semantics in generative grammar, enterprises born in the cradle of government and binding, because at least for me personally that is true. And that may not be true for the whole field, but it's certainly true for me personally. And I was very impressed by government and binding at the time, so much so that I probably would be a syntactician today if there hadn't been a job opportunity in Amherst and I was romantically involved with somebody in Amherst. So these are, so I was on my way to do a habilitation in syntax when this job opportunity came out, and I was quasi-forced to apply for a semantics position. And so that, I mean, that's just a little personal story here. But for me, of course, as a syntactician, I have to rely on the input that syntax gives me, and I'm picky. I'm looking for good input and insightful input there. So that's one side. But there's also the more the methodological side that was important, like what came from syntax. I mean, if you just look at Montague, basically, I mean, Montague himself, I mean, he had no idea about what an explanatory syntax is. So, I mean, all you see there is that sentences somehow get stitched together and the output has to be grammatical. And so that is a big thing that first, I mean, I learned from, say, government and binding. But then there's also the methodological point that for me comes out of minimalism, and that is the importance of the interfaces. And so I work both with the syntactic interfaces, but then I also work with Lisa Selkirk currently on the meaning of prosody. And there we together have no interface, and so we work through the syntactic interface. And so it's the constant navigation at the interfaces that I think is very much in the spirit of minimalism, as I understand it. So it's important there. So for me, in a way, the superego that was established in generative syntax has always been very, very important. In a way, the striving for a good explanation. The doing always a little more, like claiming a little more than what you can really pull off. That is part of what I learned. And I think that has done the field a lot of good, to just have this ambition, even if you can't pull it off. To also like having an education in philosophy and logic, there's a very strong sense that you should never be wrong. And so that is also, I learned from my syntactician friends, is, you know, just try it out, stick out your neck. You can be wrong, and the next day, I mean, you do something different, and you don't lose face in that way. And that's pretty much impossible in philosophy. Let's not even talk about logic. And
you mean that we are so often wrong that nobody should be ashamed, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, that is, but also that has propelled the field forward, I think, because you have, you know, even something that was maybe a little speculative, you've taken the time to spell it out, to write it down. There are consequences that you can only see once you work out a theory in a little bit more detail. And I think that's a big difference between linguistics and philosophy, that our field has moved. And philosophy, I mean, if you go to a philosophy conference like this, always the old topics. And it's anyway, so that is my little different take.
Thank you very much. Should we go now to you guys or to the other question from internet? Please, please.
Thank you. My question is both for Luigi and Angelika, and is on a sort of division of labor between syntax and semantics. From Cinque's work, we've learned that different semantic classes of adverbs are invariantly rigidly ordered across different languages. To arrive at the hierarchy of adverbs, Cinque turns to transitivity tests involving adverbs belonging to different semantic classes. He takes combinations of two adverbs of different classes in the two possible orders each time. So A, B, B, A. In my MA thesis and in a paper with Ana Paula Quadros, who gave a talk on semantics yesterday here, we've observed a couple of combinations of adverbs which are expected under the Cinque hierarchy, provided that they are in the correct order, I mean, in the hierarchical order, but nonetheless, their combination gives rise to ungrammatical results. Such cases generally involve combinations of two modal adverbs in the same sentence. So, for instance, epistemic probably and dialectic of possibility possibly, analytic of necessity or deontic necessarily, and, for instance, the irrealis adverb maybe, perhaps. And or combinations of a modal adverb with, for instance, an habitual aspect adverb, like usually, for instance, both in the Cinquean hierarchical order and in the reverse order. I'm giving you an example in Italian just to illustrate that. So, forse I brasiliani normalmente sono buoni giocatori, perhaps Brazilian usually are good players, with force perhaps, where force perhaps should, according to the Cinque hierarchy, precede normally, normalmente. Some Italians reject this sentence. Now, the same thing is observed in the syntax of the peripheries. So yesterday, in RIZZI's talk, for instance, there's only one focus per sentence. So we cannot have a corrective focus co-occurring with, say, an informational focus, independently on the order of these two focus. My question is now for both RIZZI and KRATZER. Luigi, how can we deal with such cases? Should we expect an answer from semanticists? And Angelika, do you think the impossibility of such combinations is a matter of semantics? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Well, I mean, anything I can't deal with, I would refer to the syntacticians. I mean, that's the short answer. I don't have a general answer. I think I would investigate one phenomenon at a time. And with respect to the one focus position, I think we already started a nice discussion. I mean, for me, it was complete news that Italian doesn't have double WH questions or triple or whatever. And so my guess would be to probe into that, whether there's a relationship between just having this one focus position in Italian with just having single WH questions. So that, I mean, that's, and then of course we don't know what the outcome would be. And I would also sort of look at, you know, we already like talking about this, we sort of saw that, I mean, even in languages like English and German, where you have double focus and you have double WH questions, there's always an asymmetry involved. That sort of there's one focus is usually a contrastive topic focus, or also the question, there's a certain asymmetry, a semantic asymmetry that has been observed. And then, of course, you want to explain that. Why is that? Where does this come from? I think you have to just probe into the question and see whether you get an explanation. There is something very interesting coming out of the work on contrastive topic by Noah Constant, which is semantic work, who sort of observes that just semantically, if you extract a focus out of a constituent that has another focus in it, the semantic object that you get is a set of questions. And that is, of course, exactly the semantic question that contrastive topics, that's the semantic object that contrastive topics are anaphoric to. And so this is, in a way, a strike of luck that you sort of get an explanation, but I think there are many other questions that open up, like what happens in, say, languages that only have WH in C2, what happens in those languages, what happens like in Romanian, where you move all WH phrases to the left periphery. And so I would see it that there's interesting questions for collaboration that come out of that, and we don't know in advance who gets the explanation. You just try.
I agree absolutely with what Angelika said. In fact, in order to deal with the restrictions on focus occurrence, I already turned, in a sense, to interpretation, right? As I proposed in the mini course, my own simple-minded view of what interpretation is, of course, and so I'm sure there is a lot of space for better understanding of what is going on, but my story is extremely simple. It's non-syntactic in the sense that it's a real interface explanation. This is to say, you get a certain interpretation in the bipartite structure that is created by a focal head, and then you get certain constraints in this bipartite interpretation that has the consequence that another focus cannot occur in one part of the configuration. So I've already, in fact, turned to that side for this issue. The problems related to the interpretation of multiple questions are extremely interesting, and there is a very interesting issue of parameterization. That is to say, how do we distinguish the different types of languages that we observe, right? So just looking at WH movement, there are these cases that should be somehow teased apart in terms of minimal properties, languages in which everything gets moved to the left periphery necessarily, languages in which one element is moved to the left periphery, and then you can have several elements in C2, languages in which all the elements are in C2, languages which simply do not allow for multiple WH elements to occur in a structure. So a very important topic here is to try to understand how to minimally characterize the variation between these systems. There have been attempts, for instance, Andrea Calabrese, as I mentioned yesterday, tried to look at the properties that characterize languages like Italian in terms of the uniqueness of WH elements and the uniqueness of focus, essentially identifying parameters that are operative on the PF interface. So that is one possible way to go, but certainly there's much more to say. Now, about your general question, to the two of us, again, as we are also introducing more personal notes here. When I first read Guglielmo Cinque's book, I had the impression that, okay, this is a fantastic problem book, problem set for semanticists. I thought if I was a semanticist, I would take Cinque's book and I would try to deal with each single ordering constraint that he identifies, and I would try to come up with an explanation. Maybe in some cases that's possible, in other cases maybe it's not, but the data set that comes out from that book is absolutely fantastic, and I think that, in fact, it has inspired work in semantics, but I think a lot remains to be done in considering these aspects. For other things, like the left periphery, movement is very important, right? So one can look within the syntactic box to find explanatory principles accounting for the possibility of certain orders and the impossibility of other orders. But as far as the hierarchy that Guglielmo has identified is concerned, movement is of relatively little relevance, except for cases in which you get surprising inversions of orders. So that's something that I think has inspired and could continue to inspire semanticists.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, completely agree. It has like Valentina Kar's work. Also, Marcin Murzicki, Anna Paula mentioned Marcin Murzicki. I mean, he took up the Cinque program in a constructivist framework, where you sort of assume you have a particular sequence of functional heads, and the reason adverbs have these meanings in those positions, it's due, I mean, in particular for adverbs that have different meanings in different positions, you say, like legally he parked, or rudely he departed, as opposed to he departed rudely, get two different meanings. And so the idea is you have one root, and if you merge it low, there is a functional head that produces the manner interpretation, and if you merge it high, there is a functional head that produces the other interpretation. So these are semantic works that were inspired by Cinque, and they have made something interesting out of it.
Is it okay? Yeah? So, yes, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm kind of nervous, but I'll try to finish my question. Talking about the epistemology of the generative program and the desire to prove an universal grammar, how do you face the variation that we keep finding through the languages, and how to keep motivated being a rational linguist facing so many parameters? And I want to know what are the reasons that make you still believe that linguistics must be faced as a natural and a formal science from both of you. Thank you.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Maybe you start.
I start, yeah. Okay, so some commentators have concluded that from the proliferation of parameters, one can derive a kind of reductio ad absurdum of the model. I really disagree with that. I really disagree with that. What I think has happened, and that is overlooked by these commentators. Neumayer, for instance, wrote about that books wrote about that, and several others. It seems to me that what is not observed in these comments is that there's been a major shift on the notion of parameters, a major shift, which is from the idea, the very first idea in the late 70s even, already in the early 80s things were changing, that parameters are properties expressed on principles. And of course, that idea led to the expectation that there would be very few parameters, simply because there were few principles, right? Take GB, for instance. Let's say one could say there are maybe 10 or 20 modules, or in any event, that is the order of magnitude. And then one would expect, if each module has one parameter, you would expect that the order of magnitude of parameters is determined by the numerosity of principles. But then very clearly, very quickly it became clear that this was not the right way to go, simply because a number of properties are not systemic, are not ascribable to modules, and have their roots in the functional lexicon, very clearly. Take, for instance, the fact that at some point, it was the theory of binding, right? So, there are binding principles, and then there are languages with long-distance binding. So, the initial approach was to say, okay, so the binding module is parameterized. But then clearly that's false. If you look at languages with these properties, Icelandic and similar languages, it's clear that the possibility of going long distance is related to the presence of a particular lexical item in the lexicon. So let's say in Icelandic, something like sig is long distance, and then if you take the more complex form corresponding to himself, let's say, then it's short distance, right? So you cannot make a general statement of the kind this language selects the long distance value. It's a property of a particular lexical item. And then the whole parameterization, that's the famous Borer-Chomsky conjecture, that Chomsky doesn't know why it's ascribed to him as well, because he says, well, it's Borer's conjecture, but then it's called the Borer-Chomsky conjecture, which says, well, the locus of variation is the functional lexicon, right? And then if the locus of variation is the functional lexicon, the numerosity of parameters is determined by the size of the functional lexicon. And then if it is true that the functional lexicon is big, you'll have many parameters. It's just inevitable, just an inevitable consequence. What is important is not the number of parameters, but the deductive structure of the system. So the fact it remains true, even with a very large number of parameters, is that one particular choice has systemic consequences because of the rich deductive structure of the system. So it interacts with many other things, and it generates consequences. And our task as comparative syntacticians is to follow these sometimes very complex deductive paths. But the theory has a lot of explanatory power due to these deductive paths. So that would be my take on the parametric issue. Then there were other questions, but
yeah, so I mean, in semantics, parametrization somehow plays no role as far as I can see. There has been some discussion about semantic universals, and I'm not sure. I mean, without doubt, there are languages, for example, that do not have any essentially qualificational noun phrases. But that's not a parameterization. I mean, that's just a choice a language has in choosing what kind of lexical items it wants. I mean, it's not, in the sense, it's not a parameterization, but it gives you a different semantic system. So my own take on this question is that parameterization doesn't play a role. I mean, maybe there are some generalizations, like of this kind of like Greenberg type generalizations, but there's no deep sense, I think, of parameterization in semantics, apart from the fact, I mean, you just, a language may choose not to have one thing as opposed to the other. I mean, it's not, you know, it's no, we now know it's no big loss to a language if it doesn't have DPs that express generalized qualifiers, for example. So it just may choose that and at some point add it, at some point lose it. And, but it's not, I mean, it's very different from parameters in syntax, where you just get a different syntactic system, and that doesn't happen in semantics, so the basic interpretational principles stay the same, I think. And so I would say, and even, you know, I mean, there's no such thing as a semantic universal, and so that's, I mean, in that, yeah. I mean, it's, or maybe everything is a semantic universal. I mean, that is, maybe that's, but I would not make a difference between these two statements. Yes.
Thank you. Roberta wants to comment.
No, it's just because I think that one of the things that Angelika aims at is trying to have the notion of semantic parameters, in particular with respect, and then I think it's, in a way, it may be a completely failure, he may be wrong, but I think what he was trying to do in his famous paper in '98 was trying to explain how language variation could be explained via semantic parameterization that would give you the different sorts of languages. At that point, he was trying to explain the difference between Chinese and French.
Oh, and the mass count.
Yeah, and the nominal domain. Yeah, that's what I mean. Like,
yeah.
So the hypothesis was is if you were a language where you had nouns in argument position and only that, then it would follow that, and that's kind of deductive system as well. It would follow that you wouldn't have number morphology and all that. It would have mandarin. It would give you mandarin. But if you have the two forms could be in argument position and also in predicative position, it would give you English or and this kind of. It turned out that it seems very complicated, and he's been changing this. Now it's the number parameter, but I think it does make some sense to think about semantic parameters.
I'm still wondering on whether I would call that a semantic parameter as opposed to a morphological parameter or a syntactic parameter.
Yeah, that's,
I mean,
that's hard. That's a hard question.
That is, I would call it a syntactic or morphological parameter.
It might be a morphological. I'm not
because
sure
a semantic parameter would be something.
Yeah,
I think I have even a hard time imagining it.
Yeah.
I mean, would some language not use functional application or something? It's unimaginable.
No, I don't think like this, but we do have language that do not have articles, for instance.
Yeah, but that's not semantic. Yeah.
In a sense, the way he tries to build it, it is semantic in the sense that you have a language that allows a bare noun, which is an E, and also a ET, or a language that only allows an ET, and that in that sense it is, and it is semantic, and it's also, of course, morphological, right? But it's in a way how the functional lexicon is structured in a language. I think I'm not sure. Just
I mean, I could sort of imagine, like what I could imagine is that maybe languages differ in the repertoire of semantic composition operations that allow. I mean, my personal take on it, I would doubt that that is possible, but at least I can imagine it. That you know, there's a language that allows function composition, and another language doesn't allow that. I mean, that would be okay. So that's a hypothesis one could put on the table of what kind of type shifting operations you allow. So that is so the kind of thing. So we have a repertoire of composition operation, and that
one language allows that and another one doesn't. And so I think that we can, yeah, my gut feeling is that this is not possible, but I can imagine at least that one may entertain it.
Okay, if that language allows this sort of type shifting, then you would have some consequences that goes in other parts of the language. That's
And then there's the question, of course, what these type shifting operations are, and whether there are not, whether it doesn't really boil down to being morphology in the end. So it's functional vocabulary.
It's
so that's
functional vocabulary.
and so that is something that we could debate in a way. Maybe not with me, because I'm sort of the more skeptic and the.
If I may add one thing, I understand Angelika's skepticism, and I'm aware of Gennaro's approach. I think maybe the basis of your skepticism has to do with the fact that a crucial empirical condition on a parameter should be learnability. This is the child should be able to fix it, and not to fix it in a million years, right? But in a very short time in which language is acquired, and on the basis of the evidence that is presented to the child. So this naturally leads us to look for parameters on the PF interface, on that side, because there the evidence is abundant, and so you clearly have very visible flags of which way your language is going, so that parameters having an impact on interpretation could be acceptable parameters from the viewpoint of learnability only if they were related to some very visible and easily accessible property.
Okay. Are you satisfied? Yeah? Okay, we have another one from the internet. Yeah?
Yeah, so this one is from Professor Cristiano Chezzi, I guess, Associate Professor of Linguistics, right, and Director of NETS Center for Neurocognition, Epistemology, and Theoretical Syntax at the University School for Advanced Studies in Pavia. Yeah. According to the current understanding of the structural backbone, few functional categories seem to be recursive, for example, topic in the left periphery. And most of them cannot, that is, they cannot be merged twice or in different positions. For example, right, in mood, epistemic, T-perfect, aspect completive, universal, D-definite, etc. As a result, we have a rich but basically finite functional phrasal structure. How would you explain, derive this absence of recursion either in syntactic, why merge should be limited in these cases, or semantic terms? Is there a limit on the size of interpretable semantic types?
Okay. So now
I'll give the short answer, and you have to give the long answer, because it definitely has to be derived in syntactic terms. There's absolutely nothing the semantics has to say about this. In semantics, there is just an infinite hierarchy of types, and I think this is correct, and we should not try to limit this, but hope, or I think I'm pretty confident that the syntacticians can get a handle on the limitations. Yeah, so I think that, so I have not much to say that. I would not recommend attempting to limit the types from the semantic side.
Yes, it's a difficult question. It's a very interesting question, I think. In fact, in the very early formulations of the cartographic ideas with Guglielmo Cinque, we almost considered the possibility of calling cartographic structures as the non-recursive part of language. This is the recursive part consists in putting together these complex molecules, right? So there are these very complex molecules in which you basically observe no recursion, and then the recursive part, of course, you can continue and extend indefinitely a structure. Why is it so? It's a complex question. I don't know the answer, to tell the truth. it is quite clear that the very special case within these cartographic structures is the case of topics, for instance, right? So topicality seems to be an exception because clearly we can have recursion. So we may, in a sense, ask the opposite question. Why is it that topic should be exceptional? Maybe what Angelika said at the beginning could help in this. Part of the story could be that, in fact, some apparent cases of recursions of topics, if one adopts a typology of topic a la Frascarelli, Hinterholzl, and Bianchi, as that was mentioned in one of the talks, in fact, it's not genuine recursion, but you simply have occurrences of different kinds of topics. I don't think this can be right, because at least the lowest kind of topic in that typology, the familiarity topic, is very clearly recursive. And you can have as many of them as you wish. So maybe topicality is a genuine exception. But the interesting thing is that I'm spending time to talk about the exception and not the rule, because I don't know, I really don't know what the rule is. So it's, I thank Cristiano Chesi, who was my student, for the very interesting question, and maybe at the next conference I will have something more interesting to say. It's a clearly valid observation, and then as you know, clearly valid observations that are not obvious, this should have an explanation somewhere, but I'm not able to address the question at the moment.
I mean, even if topic is kind of just moving to any position, you would still not expect it to be recursive, because then it would just piggyback on other positions that are independently given, and there would be, I mean, that would not be recursive. So there you would, I mean, it would even be worse. I mean, then you could have maybe 10 topics. I don't know how many cartographic heads you had. I mean, it would like 12 or 16, and that is absurd with topics, because you can have, yeah.
Okay, so, yep.
Eduardo has a question, and then I have a question. So there are two questions on queue right now.
So I studied part of the literature in government embedding theory, and I think by that time we had very clear correlation between semantics and syntax in many works, many dissertations. One of these examples is the work by Robert May about quantifier raising and things like this. And I would like to hear from you something about in the minimalist theory, the past 20 years, how this relation between syntax and semantics borne out predictions, for example, for focal sensitive particles. That's something that can be related to both your work in cartography and in semantics. So I don't know if you understand the question, but I would like to know, to hear from you more about this interface between syntax and semantics, and how when analysis is able to borne out predictions for the other part of the language, let's say. Okay.
Well, difficult question, so let's just, I'll inch my way into it, and then you can ask further. So the question of quantification is an interesting one, because what you know semantically is that quantifiers are of a type, like in particular if they're in object position, they're of a type that they're hard to interpret in situ. And so that was already a phenomenon that Frege recognized. What was so interesting for us when Robert May's work came along is that he sort of showed that these qualifiers, qualifier scope, shows certain properties of movement. That was, in a way, very enlightening for us. And so the question is, did this kind of enlightenment continue after that? So that is hard, so maybe you could...
Yes. Well, I think the question is for a semanticist more than for a syntactician. From my perspective, what I can say is that I don't see any reason why the minimalist technology should be less appealing to somebody doing formal semantics than the government binding technology. In fact, certain aspects like the phasal structure seems to me could be appealing for a semanticist. I don't know if it is true, but at least it's a step in the direction of reducing the chunks that are interpreted and then putting them together. That maybe could be appealing for a semanticist, even though, again, this is not something on which I can say anything interesting. It seems to me that something like May's contribution is completely consistent with further developments. If you think, for instance, of work by Danny Fox that, again, crucially uses ideas like QR and the interaction of QR with ellipsis phenomenon of various sorts, that was developed more or less simultaneously as minimalism, and so clearly Danny saw some kind of inspiration in the minimalist technology. So personally, it seems to me that minimalism is fully consistent with a kind of approach to the interfaces that really looks at interpretive properties with the tools of formal semantics.
All right. So we only have time for...
just a comment. And, what about focus-sensitive particles? What do you think about the properties that the left periphery has, and the sensitivity to some items that can interact with these focus properties?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm thinking about focus-sensitive particles, I'm basically thinking about a Ruth type of semantics. And so you have an adverb like only, and what you want to say about the adverb like only is probably whatever Achilles wants to say about adverbs. And so only is focus-sensitive. That means it needs to see alternatives in its scope. And there's actually there is a debate going on in semantics what that relation is between only and the alternatives. I mean, Ruth had the very interesting idea that there's no formal relation at all. So only is context sensitive with respect to its domain, and just a focus all by itself creates the alternatives and creates an anaphoric relationship that is then picked up indirectly by the focus-sensitive operator. So that is, in a way, what's in my head about focus-sensitive operators. And so maybe you're sort of interested, like, in whether, I think maybe in early work by Chomsky, where there's a particular, there's assumed that there's some kind of movement of the focus constituent to the scope site. And so I don't know what the current story about that is. I mean, there are difficulties with that because you would expect island sensitivity, I suppose, which you very clearly do not get. I mean, you can have a focus-sensitive operator associating
with, say, an adjective that is modifying something 10 miles away. And so, I mean, at least for me, that presented a problem to thinking that this relation is one that is established by movement or is a syntactic one to begin with.
Let me just add that I try to stay away from focus-sensitive particles because I'm not quite sure I understand how they work syntactically. There is a related issue, though, which is focus in situ, right? And then there it is necessary for somebody who does the cartography to say something sensible, because clearly, you know, again, you find the same split among languages. There are those that have obligatory movement for WH movement, those that have obligatory in situ, those that have both options, and the same is true for focus in situ. So my hope is that essentially whatever mechanism, you know, WH movement is the guiding metaphor, right, for as Chomsky so clearly already in 1977 on WH movement that shows everything essentially. So that the hope is that whatever is valid to account for the variation and the mechanisms that are necessary for distinguishing between WH movement and WH in situ languages should extend to focus movement and focus in situ languages. And I'm still trying to remain faithful to that metaphor.
So I have to get to the last question, Monica's. Monica, just to say, now we were worried that we didn't have enough questions, and now what happened, no? Right. Okay, please go ahead.
I would like to ask you something about counterfactuality, but actually I would like you to listen to a condition and tell me what you think. So if you were addressing us, this audience that is made out of people from all over Brazil and many people from outside of Brazil, different moments in their careers and studies in linguistics, as the graduating class of 2018, what would you say?
I think that's a nice question to,
Yes.
yeah, to round it up.
Well, I mean, does it have to be the graduating class or the incoming class, the first semester, the freshmen? Maybe I'll take the incoming class.
Okay,
and you take
please.
the outcoming class. And so for the incoming class, I mean, I would give some advice what maybe the most promising areas would be to investigate. And I think that is sort of the investigation of underdescribed languages. I think I would go there. Let's say, I mean, if I were in the same position again, that's what I would do. And I don't think it would have been a good idea when I started linguistics to go there just because we knew so much less. So we just didn't have the tools at the time to say something interesting, insightful about underdescribed languages, but now we have the very best fieldwork techniques. And we also have very interesting theories. Theories in both syntax and semantics, I think, are developed to a point where we can really do very, very serious work on underdescribed languages. And so that would be what I would do.
Yeah, my advice, I guess, would be on the balance between experimental work and theoretical work. So there is a very clear trend, which is fully understandable, in favor of experimental work, right? So we ourselves do experimental linguistics, and there are very obvious reasons and very well-justified reasons for that. Essentially, we want a very strong database for our hypothesis. We want to use all the methodological tools that are available, and that is possible through experimentation and so on and so forth. On the other hand, there is a danger. There's a danger that at some point the investment on methodology is not balanced by an equal investment in theory, and that I think is a great danger. There are certain domains of the cognitive sciences where this has happened, and it's really to the detriment of the fields, right? So one property that characterized in a very clear way our field from the very beginning, and this is something that we should all credit to Chomsky, is the fact that theoretical elaboration was absolutely central. So you really had to understand how the system worked, to have a basic understanding of the elements and of the basic computations, and then starting from there you would build predictions, and then predictions would be testable in precise ways, and so on and so forth. This part is extremely important, so I think that we should resist the temptation of just going experimental. The experimental part is absolutely essential. I'm the first to try to do that, not the best of my knowledge, but it is really crucial to have a strong theoretical basis to generate hypotheses of some interest that can be then subjected and submitted to experimental verification. So I'd really try to push as many students as possible to keep in mind the theoretical avenue in addition to the experimental path.
I mean, I would, I mean, if I were to design university programs, I would put all the methodology part, like the experimental part, in the undergraduate part of the education. And say by the time you go to graduate school, you go in linguistics. Yeah. So you should, in a way, the methods, I mean, just like in the natural sciences, I think there was a question about natural sciences somewhere too. It's what's if you start studying chemistry or physics, I mean, there's a certain requirement that you know about basic experimental techniques, and that would be an idea to maybe, if you don't have the requirements, to an extra year, to an MA, learn the experimental methods, and then go into linguistics so you can use them. So that would be my wish. So that would be for the outgoing class, for the people who become deans. And
all right. Okay. Is there any question that if I don't ask, I would die? So something like that?
Well, there's the dinner still. Yeah,
yes, yes. So I thank you very much, and I would like to Roberta to make the closing remarks of, did it attend what we expected in general, or is it okay?
Yeah, I think it was really nice. Thank you, Ina. Thank you, Angelika. Thank you, RIZZI. Thank you all for being here. The idea of making this debate was, at the beginning, to be a little bit more informal and to open place for a question that nobody really asked here, but it was, I thought that we would have more people who work with language teaching, who are teachers, and who could be interested in what we are talking. So the idea was, okay, what we are doing is somehow, or has to be somehow, important to those who are doing their jobs at school, who are teaching language, or who are dealing with all sorts of linguistic problems that we have. So that was the idea, but yeah, I think it was really nice, and a more informal meeting as well, because we are always used to those very formal way of relating in a conference. So it's like, let's try some sort of debate. And then Ina said that she could do this, so she did it in a very nice way, so thank you.
Okay, thank you all. And you can continue on the dinner, yes. Please eat first, and then discuss it. Drink first. Drink first. I thank you all, yeah. And maybe the next time we will repeat it, because as I feel it worked out very nicely, okay?